Level 1. The kid who could read numbers. You're 14 years old and you're sitting in a public library because the internet at home got cut off again. You're not doing homework. You're watching stock tickers on a free financial website, tracking the same 5 companies every day for 3 months, writing the prices down in a spiral notebook by hand. You don't fully understand why prices move, but you notice patterns. You notice that one company's stock dips every Tuesday morning and recovers by Thursday. You notice that another one spikes whenever a specific news source publishes anything about its sector. Nobody taught you this. You just looked long enough that the noise started to have a shape. Your math teacher notices your notebook by accident one afternoon. She looks at your hand-drawn charts and asks what they are. You explain. She stares at you for a long moment and then tells you that you should be in AP Economics. You're not. You're in the remedial track because your attendance record is poor. You miss school sometimes because there's no one to make sure you go. You go home that night and you calculate, using pencil and multiplication, that if you had put $500 into one specific company 8 weeks ago, based on the pattern you spotted, you'd have $740 today. You don't have $500. You've never had $500. But you understand with total clarity that you can see something other people can't. That's the most dangerous thing a person can realize about themselves. Level 2, the scholarship kid, you're 18. Full academic scholarship to a state university, finance major. First person in your family to set foot on a campus that isn't a community college. The other kids in your program come from money. They talk about their parents' portfolios the way you talked about lunch options. They have internship connections handed to them over dinner. They wear clothes that cost more than your monthly food budget without thinking about it. You don't resent them. You study them the same way you studied the tickers, looking for the pattern underneath the surface. What you find is that most of them are not smarter than you. They are more comfortable than you, which looks like confidence, which gets mistaken for competence. You file this observation away. Your professors notice you within the first semester. One of them, an older man named Dr. Ellison, who spent 12 years at a hedge fund before academia, keeps you after class one Thursday and tells you that your midterm analysis was the most technically precise work he's seen from an undergraduate in several years. He asks where you learned to think like that. You tell him a public library and a spiral notebook. He laughs. Then he stops laughing because he realizes you're serious. He becomes your mentor. He introduces you to a world you've been watching from the outside. The architecture of markets, the mechanics of derivatives, the mathematics of risk. You absorb all of it in the way that people absorb things when they have no safety net, and learning is the only asset they own. You graduate top of your class. You have 3 job offers before the ceremony. Level 3, the analyst. You're 23, junior analyst at a mid-size investment firm in Chicago. 40-hour weeks that are actually 70. A salary that sounds large until you divide it by the hours. Your job is to build financial models, projections, valuations, risk assessments that senior analysts then present as their own work. This is standard. You know it going in. You do it without complaint because you're learning the infrastructure of how institutional money actually moves, which is different from how it's described in textbooks. What you learn is this: the market is not rational. It is not efficient. It is a machine run by human beings who are afraid of being wrong in public, and that fear creates predictable, exploitable behavior at scale. You build a model in your spare time, off the clock, on your personal laptop. That tracks a specific category of institutional trading pattern. Pension funds, endowments, large index funds. When they rebalance their portfolios at predictable intervals, they create brief, measurable price distortions in certain smaller stocks. The distortions last between 4 and 11 minutes. Your model can identify them approximately 8 minutes before they peak. You show this model to no one. You open a personal brokerage account with $3,200, everything you've saved, and you test it quietly for 6 months. At the end of 6 months, you have $41,000. You close the laptop. You sit very still for a long time, then you open it again and start building a better version. Level 4, the edge. You're 26. You've left the firm. You manage your own capital now from a 1-bedroom apartment with 2 monitors and a connection. Speed you pay $800 a month for Because milliseconds cost real money in this business. Your strategy has a name in your private notes: the lag window. The gap between when a large institutional order hits the market and when the broader price reflects it is not zero. It is small, sometimes under a minute, but it is consistent enough to build a system around. You are not the only person who knows this gap exists. High-frequency trading firms have entire engineering teams working on variations of this problem. The difference is they're working in microseconds, fighting each other with co-location servers and fiber optic cables running in straight lines between cities to shave fractions of a millisecond off their latency. You're not competing with them on speed. You're competing on prediction. Your model doesn't need to be faster. It needs to anticipate, not react. You spend 8 months refining it. You eat the same 4 meals on rotation. You don't date anyone seriously. You wake up at 5 a.m. and you don't stop thinking about the problem until midnight. By the end of that year, your account holds $340,000. You're 27 years old and you've never told another human being how you made it. Level 5. The fund a man named Carter finds you. You don't know how. You were careful about your trading footprint, spread across multiple accounts, no single position large enough to flag anyone's attention. But Carter is a former quantitative trader who now runs a small family office, and he has been watching certain unusual patterns in the options market for 2 years. He narrowed the source to someone in the Chicago area. He hired a data consultant. He found you. He calls you on a Tuesday afternoon. He says he's not interested in reporting you to anyone. He says he's interested in making you very wealthy. You meet him in a hotel lobby. He's older than you expected. Early 60s, quiet clothes, the kind of calm that comes from having already made and lost and remade a fortune. He explains that he has $40 million in capital he's looking to deploy through a strategy exactly like yours, if your numbers hold up under scrutiny. You spend 6 weeks showing him the numbers. They hold up. You launch a fund, $7 million to start, with the remainder released in tranches as you prove the model. You take a management fee and a performance cut. Within 14 months, you've returned 34% net of fees. Carter releases the remaining capital. You hire 2 people, a developer and a risk analyst. You move out of the 1-bedroom. You buy a proper desk. You're 29. You have $3.4 million in personal net worth. You haven't slept more than 5 hours a night since the fund launched, but you don't mind. The problem is still interesting. Level 6, the line. The model starts to slow down. Not because it's wrong, because it's working too well. Your own trading activity is beginning to affect the very prices you're predicting. You're large enough now that you're part of the distortion, not just a detector of it. You hire a second developer. You try 12 variations of the core approach. 8 of them don't work. 3 work at reduced efficiency. 1, a variation that incorporates satellite data on shipping container movement as a leading indicator for certain retail stocks, works better than the original. But there's a problem with the satellite data approach, and you know it before you ever run the first trade with it. The data you're using is technically public. Satellite imagery firms sell it commercially, but you're using it in combination with a proprietary feed from a logistics company that one of your early investors has a board seat on. That investor mentioned in passing over dinner that the logistics company's internal shipment data would be available to you if you found it useful. You find it useful. You tell yourself it's a gray area. The data isn't classified. The logistics company isn't publicly traded. No specific company's material, non-public information is being used. You tell yourself this, and you mostly believe it. You run the first trade. It returns 4.2% in 11 days. You run the next one, 3.8%. You're back to full efficiency. You don't look too closely at the line you just stepped over. You keep moving. Level 7, the network. You're 33. The fund manages $280 million. Your personal net worth is somewhere north of $18 million, most of it illiquid and tied up in the fund's structure. You move in different circles now. The conference circuit, the charity dinners, the invitation-only gatherings at mountain retreats where people who run large pools of capital meet to discuss the landscape. At these gatherings, information moves differently than it does in public. Nobody passes a document across a table. Nobody says anything explicit. What happens is more ambient than that. A CEO mentions, in the context of a broader conversation about supply chains, that one of his company's major contracts is in a more precarious position than the market currently understands. A board member of a pharmaceutical company expresses what she describes as personal uncertainty about whether a particular drug trial is going to hit its primary endpoint. None of this is said as a tip. It's said as conversation, as context, as the kind of thing powerful people say to each other because they assume the people they're speaking with already have access to equivalent information. You listen, you file it, you think carefully about what can be legally acted on and what can't. And then slowly, over the course of 2 years, you act on more of it than you should. Not clumsily, not obviously. Small positions held through intermediaries, sized to stay below the thresholds that trigger automatic regulatory review. Nothing that could be proven in isolation. But the pattern is there. If someone looked at the whole picture, someone is looking. Level 8. The investigators. You don't know about the investigation for 8 months. The SEC's Division of Enforcement has a unit that does nothing but look for statistical anomalies in trading data. They don't start with a tip. They start with a spreadsheet. They look for accounts that consistently profit in the window immediately preceding market-moving events. Earnings surprises, merger announcements, clinical trial results, at a rate that exceeds what random chance or public information could plausibly explain. Your fund appears in their initial screen at month 4 of the investigation. By month 6, they've subpoenaed your trade records. By month 7, they've identified 3 positions that they consider worth pursuing. By month 8, they've contacted the FBI. You find out none of this through official channels. You find out because a lawyer you know, someone who does white-collar defense work, mentions at a dinner that he's been asked to represent someone connected to a fund that rhymes with yours. He doesn't say your name. He doesn't need to. You go home that night and you sit in the dark in your office for 3 hours. You think about the library, the spiral notebook, the patterns in the noise. You think about the $3,200 account and the 6 months of careful, clean trading that produced $41,000. You think about how far you could have gone if you'd stayed inside that lane. You pick up the phone and you call your own lawyer. Level 9, the architecture of survival. Your lawyer's name is Patricia. She's been doing securities defense for 22 years, and she has the specific kind of calm that comes from having sat across from federal prosecutors hundreds of times. She tells you 3 things in the first meeting. First, do not move money, close positions, or alter any records. If you do, obstruction becomes a separate and much more serious problem. Second, the investigation is likely broader than you know and narrower than you fear. The SEC is not omniscient. They have 3 positions they can probably prove and a hypothesis about a dozen more. The question is what they can actually support. Third, cooperation is a lever, not a surrender. If the evidence is what she thinks it is, the intelligent move is to control the narrative before someone else does. You spend the next 4 months in legal preparation. You produce documents. You give testimony. You are careful and precise and truthful about everything except the 2 things you are not truthful about, because Patricia has assessed that those 2 things cannot be proven and that lying about them is the lower risk position. The SEC reaches out about a settlement. The number they propose is $23 million in disgorgement and penalties. Your lawyer counters. The final number is $14.8 million in a 2-year ban from managing public funds. You don't go to prison, you write the check. You close the fund. You give Carter back his capital, plus a return that, even accounting for the settlement, beats the market index for the period by 6 points. Carter calls you when it's done. He doesn't say anything for a moment. Then he says, "You know the original model was clean. You didn't need the rest of it. You know." Level 10, the other side. The 2-year ban ends on a Tuesday. You are 37 years old. You have $4.2 million left after the settlement, legal fees, and 3 years of operating expenses. Less than you had at 33. More than most people will see in a lifetime. You don't go back to running a fund immediately. You spend 6 months doing something you haven't done since you were 14. Sitting with the numbers quietly, without pressure, without a position open, without anyone waiting on a return. You build something new, a model with no gray areas, entirely systematic, entirely rules-based, derived from nothing except publicly available data processed through a proprietary analytical framework. No satellite feeds from companies with board connections, no conference conversations filed away for future use. Clean in every direction. You take on two investors, both people who know exactly what happened and have assessed that the underlying intelligence is real, which the settlement did not disprove. By the end of your first full year back, the new fund returns 22%. Not as high as the peak years, but consistent, defensible, built on something that doesn't require you to sit in the dark, wondering when a lawyer you know mentions something at a dinner. You're not the richest person in the room at the conferences anymore. You're not invited to the mountain retreats, you don't miss them. Level 11, the architecture of influence. You're 42. The fund manages $600 million. You've never had an SEC inquiry since the settlement. Your compliance infrastructure is more sophisticated than firms 10 times your size because you built it yourself with the specific knowledge of exactly what regulators look for, because you've seen it from the inside of an investigation. Something unexpected happens at this level. People start asking you for advice, not about how to trade, about how to build something that lasts. How to think about risk in a way that accounts for the risks you can't model. The human ones, the ethical ones, the ones that don't show up in a backtest. You start giving talks, not on the conference circuit you used to attend, at universities, at regulatory conferences, at the invitation of a congressional committee that is trying to understand high-frequency trading and keeps getting testimony from people who have a financial interest in confusing them. You explain the mechanics clearly, without agenda. You tell them what actually happens in the lag window. You tell them which regulatory changes would actually help and which ones are theater. You become, somewhat improbably, the person that people in power call when they want to understand something technical without being misled. It's a different kind of influence than you had before. It doesn't come from access to private information. It comes from the fact that you know the system completely, including the parts that tried to break you, and you're no longer afraid of it. Level 12, the full picture. You're 51. The fund is closed, not because it failed, because you chose to close it. You returned capital to investors at a moment when the strategy was still working, because you could see the next evolution of the market structure coming, and you didn't want to be the person who stayed too long at the table. You have enough. That's a sentence you didn't know how to say for most of your life, because growing up without enough money leaves a specific kind of scar that makes enough feel like a temporary condition rather than a destination. But you have enough. You spend your mornings working on a book, not a memoir, something more like a field guide, an honest account of how financial markets actually function at the level most people never see, written for people who don't have access to a mentor like Dr. Ellison, people who are sitting in a library right now with a spiral notebook, noticing patterns in the noise. You don't know if that kid exists, but you were that kid, and no one handed you a manual. You take calls from former analysts who are now running their own operations. You take calls from regulators who want to think through a problem. You occasionally take calls from journalists who are trying to understand something complicated. On a Tuesday afternoon in November, you're sitting at your desk and a notification comes through on your phone, a financial news alert. The company you tracked as a 14-year-old, the one that dipped every Tuesday morning, has just announced its acquisition by a larger competitor. The stock is up 34% in afternoon trading. You sit with that for a moment. Then you close the notification and go back to the page you were writing. You already knew how the pattern ended. You always did.